Yeah, again, thank you very much, Christoph, for having us in your colloquium. It's really a pity that we cannot be there in person, but I'm pretty sure that we will do this later when the train does work again. And as Christoph just said, I've got a background in environmental sociology. And from this perspective, I would like to share a presentation, an observation which I made when I started dealing with this topic. It's from my perspective, it's somehow strange that there are like central environmental discussions right now very popular, and they are all closely related to military activities. However, this topic of military actions and the environment is not very popular, at least not in the field I'm dealing with, which is environmental sociology, but also the research dealing with the socio-ecological transformation towards sustainability. Just to give two examples, for example, there's a discourse you all know about this surrounding the so-called Anthropocene Working Group proposed that the residues of the nuclear weapon tests in the mid-20s can be seen as a marker of the beginning of the Anthropocene. The main discourse, which is led by Earth system scientists as Paul Crutzen or Whit Steffen, this plays hardly any role in their elaboration on the topics. Their focus is on carbon emissions, it's on biodiversity loss, it's related to phenomena such as so-called great acceleration, but military it's not at the center. And the same holds true for critics of the Anthropocene concept from the social sciences. For instance, Jason Moore focuses on capitalism and respectively the economic driving forces and the Anthropocene, but also in his analysis, the military plays no prominent role. And similar can be witnessed concerning another recently more and more prominent concept, the concept of ecocide. And here too, the concept of ecocide has a background, a military background, which is hardly recognized. Ecocide became popular in the 1970s for referring to the usage of Agent Orange as a means of warfare in Vietnam. The environmental impacts of war are especially severe. However, also maintaining military infrastructures as well as practicing warfare in peace times is a highly resource-intensive activities and produces huge amounts of emissions. Christoph just in his introduction already gave some numbers. I've got some more, and they are all just astonishing how much they matter. I've put some of these figures on the slide. So it is estimated that in 2022, the world's armed forces are responsible for about 5.5% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. If the global military were one country, it would rank fourth with emissions exceeding Russia's emissions today. According to Neta Crawford, the total emissions of the US military amount to 117.5 million metric tons in 2019. This is more than twice as much as countries like Peru or Hungary. And per capita, it amounts in the US military to almost 40 tons. This is 10 times more than the emissions of a Swedish citizen and 5 times more than the emissions of a Chinese citizen. So now one last figure, just 1 hour flying with a fighting jet, the German Tornado, emits up to 18 tons carbon dioxide. So since according to the IPCC already today, climate change affects every region in the world, one could say, by referring to Rob Nixon, a sociologist which deals with topic like environmental justice, that the emissions of the military can be labeled as something he calls slow violence. He speaks of slow violence, of forms of violence that are produced by climate change and that take place mostly invisible and gradually, and therefore are less direct. But in addition to the direct violence that is executed by the armed forces, the military also is the main producer of the slow violence generated, or is one of the main producers of the slow violence generated by climate change. Military missions were not included in the Kyoto Protocol, that is the international treaty preceding the Paris Agreement. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement leaves it to the individual country if they include military emissions in their climate change mitigation efforts, or if they do not include it. So some do include it now, some others don't. And this is why some scholars argue that military emissions is one reason why the global emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise, despite all climate action and mitigation efforts since the 1990s. Therefore, there is a growing tension between climate change mitigation and defense goals. And especially, Christoph mentioned this, especially after Russia attacking the Ukraine and the so-called Zeitenwende in Germany, and the following, or the growing political will to fulfill the obligation under the NATO treaty to spend 2% of the GDP for military defense. This conflict intensifies. More military means more emissions. And recently, observers started to comment on this conflict. I put a very recent comment. It's from the 9th of January from the Guardian on this slide in order to illustrate it, but also a tweet from Amitav Ghosh, which is from November last year. And Ghosh argues that the fact that more money is spent for military than for climate change mitigation shows that the Western states show a higher interest in preserving the existing post-colonial geopolitical order than in combating the climate crisis. Now, Frank will take over, and I will make some more concluding remarks at the end of our talk.
Yeah, thank you, Bernd. It's also interesting to see, if you take a closer look to the Zeitenwende speech of Chancellor Scholz. No, that's okay. That he also mentions energy transition in the speech as one part of this bigger Zeitenwende, which is not only seen militarily and in terms of security policy, but also in a broader sense. And you can see the paradox situation in we are now. And I think you underlined the necessity not to leave the military violence beside our endeavor to analyze climate change and what else. I want now to situate our project in a much more broader context and highlight in short two cases to underline first the relationship of the military to energy and the relation of the military to the environment. I do this because, yes, we got funding for a core project, but our research design is even wider and intends to provide a lot of docking options, and is aimed to integrate additional partners and studies and everything and whatever. So we have a core project and we have an idea, and this idea should be even broader than our project now is. And therefore I would start with some epistemological remarks on military history, or better on doing history in the field of military, collective violence, warfare, and so on. First, one can write military history to deepen knowledge on military as an organization or on war as a social phenomenon. So history on something. But second one can write history with the military war and so on. Maybe martial masculinity, social or economical aspects of warfare and so on. And this is on the one hand, history on the military, and the other one, history with the military. These are two approaches, and they, I think, are the classics now done in military history over the last 100 years. But I think there is a third epidemiological perspective, and this is crossing the field of military war, warfare, military violence with other fields. And the key word here would be relations. And these relations, so how people, object, discourses, whatever relates to each other, are of interest of its own. In other words, relation and entanglements are itself positioned in the center of research. Our project, I think, is placed more in the third perspective. So we ask how the field of war and military relates to the environment, and on the other hand, how the environment relates to military and war. And I think this could be a fruitful endeavor because military is quite actual a sound topic, because military and soldiers are aware of their interdependencies with nature and environmental forces. And even in the old school operational military history, the environment plays an underlying, not really reflected, but crucial role. So I think military history and the history of the environment, they could be brought together, and this could be a very fruitful thing. As you are in the Institute for Environmental History, I think you know a lot of the environment, but I just want to open a little bit the black box of the military, and I want to highlight one side of the relationship, the military. So what is the military? The military is strongly connected with violence, and I think it co-evolutes with a modern state. And the military can be understood as a dispositive in the sense of a time and context specific ensemble of discourses, concepts, knowledge, actors, practices, technologies, objects, infrastructures, architectures, and whatever more. And this military dispositive organizes on a permanent temporal basis the provision, the application, and the reproduction of collective violence. And not only violence, but violence seen as a potential is organized in the military and is transformed into force, military force. And the transformation of violence into force and the provision, application, and production of violence could also be seen as a transformation of energy. So that is what is the military, but I want to just add one thing, and that is who is the military. You can read often in text, the military is this, the military is doing that, the military is thinking, but I think this is an oversimplification, and the military is a very diverse, complex organization with a heterogeneous thinking, different parties, groups, practices, and also different identities, shifting power centers. And I think it's worth to take a closer look into the container and open it, especially for our topic, which is very interesting to see how different branches of the military, different socializations within the military have a very different attitude to environment, climate change, and also what could be called or framed as low carbon warfare. And here's still another keyword on my list, the arms industries. And we should not only to forget to put also the arms industry into the context of the military. And this is part of our project because also agencies who provide the material arms production, from weapons to clothes to food or whatever, has to be taken literally into account. For example, in a kleine Anfrage, a question within the German Bundestag in the late 1980s, no, the early 1990s, sorry, there was a question: how big is the use of beef in the armed forces? And then the ministry said, "Yo, ma, it's much less than in the overall society." Yeah, and that will be celebrated as a kind of victory fighting against climate change. But as you know, maybe beef is so expensive that it could be used in the canteens of the Bundeswehr or other armies just to put here an anecdote that we should see this as a broader understanding. Also, providing and sustaining military violence must be taken into account. And then it's not only, as it often called in military literature, the sharp end, it's also military in a very broad sense. This leads me to a second point, what I call a little bit clumsy and fancy military metabolism. And now, Bernd, you can show the ships. Yeah, I want to illustrate military force and violence depends on energy, even with the example on ships and warships. On the left side, you can see the Great White Fleet. This is a project of a circumnavigation of the Earth by 14 battleships of the United States Navy in 1906, 1907. It took not 18 days, but around 14 months to make this circumnavigation of the world. But it was an event which undermined the projection of force, the possibility for the United States to perform itself as a major maritime power. And in this circumnavigation, hundreds of thousands of coal had been used. And hence, this caused huge logistical problems to sustain the fleet with energy. And this happens right in the time where we see a shift from coal to oil in naval propellant as a naval maritime propellant. And this was a very big debate in all major and also small naval powers all over the world, because topics of cost, logistical problems, doctrine, naval strategy, grand strategy, ship design, technology were discussed very intensively. And you can also see that cost was one argument for the party who said, yeah, we should stick with coal, and also cost was an argument because it's cheaper for the other side who said we should invest in oil-propelled vessels. So it's very interesting to reconstruct these discourses on a kind of energy transformation, and there is a very strong similarity to another energy transformation which you cannot see here on the slide, which occurred 100 years or 18 years before, from sail to steam or coal as the energy used for traveling in ships and also in warships. I want to make a link to the early 2000s. The badge is from 2016, but the idea of the US Naval Department or the Department of the Navy or the Great Green Fleet, they use the topic very familiar in naval thinking in the United States of the Great White Fleet in order to underline the necessity of a Great Green Fleet. Here the connection was made to the discussion replicated itself in the debate on energy dependency, on high cost of energy, and the United States Department of the Navy was investing in alternative fuel made of not of crops. It should not be made of crops from which is necessary to feed humanity, but from other kind of growing plants. And this is a project. I do not know it's fulfilled. It was that in 2020, the United States Navy should be driven by a 50-50 blend of fossil fuel and biomass. Also, the airplanes of the Navy should do this, but this project is still ongoing. Yeah, and here the discourse about the energy transformation, also environment and climate change. Climate change became part of the discourse. And you mentioned Meta Crawford, Bernd, I don't know where's my camera. And also here on her book, you can see the same picture of the Great White Fleet, who made this as a topic of a book as well. And this leads me to my second case, to NATO. And I think now military is not a late adopter of environmental issues. The military is an organization which has a high degree of knowledge on the environment. And just to start with anecdotal evidence, in the days before the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944, the Allied knocked out German weather stations in the Arctic. And so German intelligence got blinded and predicted rain and storm in the Channel regions, and Allied forecast what was much more better. And the day for the the operation could be fixed to the 6th of June, where tides at the landing beaches were predicted by military oceanographers in a perfect condition. But I choose NATO to show how ambivalent and paradoxical the military approach to nature or the environment could be. NATO showcases in a nutshell two extreme approaches how the military deals with environment. The first is geoengineering, especially weather modification. This has a long history in the military, but I just want to highlight the use of the nature for military purpose. So the environmental modification, and Bernd, you talked about this. It went to the Environment Modification Treaty that it's not allowed to use nature for military purpose and to modify the environment. It's in the Geneva Convention of 1977. Environmental aspects play a major role, and also in the Rome Statute, ecocide and so on for the International Military Criminal Court became a very interesting topic. So the environmental use for the military has been regulated during the 20th century. And on the second picture, you can see how the military organization like the NATO perceived environmental destruction as a problem for societies. Research on pollution was a highly researched topic in the NATO since the early 1960s. And I think one can say that the NATO was one of the first, or it was maybe the first international organization dealing with cross-border pollution problems. And this was institutionalized in the Committee on the Challenge of Modern Society, which was translated in German language, literally in a NATO publication as the Environmental Committee. And why NATO is so important for this and interested in the problem. And the answer gives NATO itself in this publication. I mentioned here Man's Environment and the Atlantic Alliance, because NATO says we can this. We can tackle cross-border problems. In the 1960s, not yet global problems. We have the experience, we have the power, we have the knowledge, we have the institutions to do so. And here one can see securitization of the environment by the military, and what this in its consequences mean for society as a whole. This is very interesting to be analyzed in the future, because now environment and pollution became a problem of security, of human security. And on the other hand, human security also enforces, in some sense, military intervention. And one can see that also in the discussion about climate control, how climate control and the control of the climate control regime is militarized, that there are ideas discussed that there could also be military intervention if a member state does not stick to the rules given at specific agreements. And I think here, with this, I hand over back to Bernd, and this was just a small insight in how, we in the start of this problem want to deal with the relation of military and the environment and vice versa.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Our presentation is called Greening Military Past Missions and Future Pathways. So in the end, I will also just briefly say something about, well, let's say tentatively, what kind of narratives and pathways we see so far concerning this topic of the greening of military. So there's one narrative that says that due to increasing geopolitical tensions, we cannot take care of the environment anymore, and that environmental concerns need to be abandoned. For instance, just recently, the Social Democratic member of the Defense Committee in the German Bundestag, Johannes Alt, argued that we need to get rid of environmental policies and also planning restrictions that hinder currently the production of more munition and weapons to help and support the Ukraine. However, there in recent years increased efforts, not only in Germany, but in almost in many armies. Frank referred to the US Navy already, also increased efforts of greening the armed forces. And here I would say this goes in line with general environmental discourses in society, which can be labeled as ecological modernization, meaning that the key is technology which will solve the environmental problems. And here, greening of military could be seen also as a kind of side effect of society's general ecological modernization, because the technologies which are developed for the broader context will be applied or are supposed to be applied in the military context. However, as it is with society as a whole, many problems remain unsolved. This holds true, for example, for so-called e-fuels, but also fuels from biomass, but also both would be needed for aviation, but also this discussions about green hydrogen. Both or everything of this is, of course, technological possible, but so far not very efficient and expensive. And as also Frank mentioned already, costs always play a role. And so far, something like e-fuels or green hydrogen only exists in small amounts, mainly in research context. And there is to be expected a huge competition for commercial industry who also needs the stuff in order to decarbonize. But then there's also, I think, very interesting ideas. We already mentioned Nita Crawford 2 times, and she advocates for something which can be called the greening of military doctrines. She said that it's like there are different ways or how military goals can be achieved. For instance, one example she gives is if your goal is preventing a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then you can achieve this by letting substantial parts of the US Navy cruise in this part of the Pacific. However, there are different ways to achieve this. For example, strengthening Taiwan's capacities for self-defense. Yes, and this would be like the less resource-intensive way. And then there's also a quite old narrative, and this is mainly put forward by scholars associated with the peace movement, and they argue that the best way to decrease military emissions would be disarmament. However, having like the current geopolitical situation in mind, this is right now not a very plausible scenario. Okay, I hope we could illustrate why military relations to nature are highly relevant topic for environmental research. And as Christoph and Frank said, we have just started with this research. And on our last slide, but I let it to you, is like I put some points summarizing the agenda of our research project. And so far, thanks a lot for your attention, and we are looking forward to your questions and comments on this. Thank you.